Thunder cracked above Millbrook like God's own gunshot. In his dim garage, Marcus Thompson hunched over a dying engine, grease-stained fingers fighting another losing battle against rust and time. The storm outside mirrored the storm in his chest. 3 years of raising Kofi alone, 3 years of empty dinner conversations and unpaid bills stacked like accusations on his kitchen table. Then he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist on a night like this. Soft, desperate, human. Behind his pickup truck, she crouched like a wounded animal. This slip of a girl with designer jeans torn to ribbons and a leather purse she clutched like her life depended on it. Rain streaked down her face, but Marcus knew tears when he saw them. Her eyes held secrets, dark secrets. Without hesitation, Marcus scooped up this trembling stranger and carried her into his home, wrapping her in Sophie's old blanket and setting a warm plate before her shaking hands. And when she whispered those 5 words that would shatter everything he thought he knew, Marcus realized he'd just taken in either a lost angel or the most dangerous mistake of his life. The words she whispered were simple enough. "Please don't call anyone." But the way she said them, with the practiced desperation of someone who'd begged before, made Marcus's chest tighten. He knelt beside the kitchen chair where she sat, wrapped in Sophie's faded purple blanket, her small frame nearly swallowed by the worn fabric. The girl couldn't be more than 12, maybe 13, but her eyes held the weight of someone much older. When he asked her name, she hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before answering. Emma. Just Emma. No last name, no explanation for the expensive leather purse that seemed completely out of place in his modest kitchen with its chipped counters and second-hand appliances. Marcus had learned to read people during his years as a mechanic. Hands told stories. Soft hands meant money. Calloused ones meant work. Emma's hands were soft as silk, manicured nails painted a pale pink that probably cost more than Marcus spent on groceries in a week. Yet here she sat in his kitchen at 2 a.m, soaked to the bone and terrified. The contradiction made no sense, but neither did most things in Marcus's life these days. He'd stopped trying to understand why Sarah had to die, why 8-year-old Sophie asked him every night when Mommy was coming home, why the bills kept coming even when the work didn't. Some things just were. Sophie appeared in the doorway like a ghost in her white nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy? Who's that?" Her voice carried that particular blend of curiosity and caution that all children develop when their world has already been shaken once. Marcus had hoped she'd sleep through this, whatever this was. But Sophie had always been a light sleeper, especially during storms. The thunder that had brought Emma to their door had probably been waking his daughter for the past hour. He watched as Sophie's gaze moved from Emma's designer purse to her muddy clothes to her tear-stained face, putting together pieces of a puzzle she was too young to solve. "This is Emma," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "She's going to stay with us tonight." The words felt strange in his mouth, foreign. When was the last time they'd had a house guest? When was the last time anyone had needed them? Sophie nodded with the easy acceptance of childhood, already moving toward the refrigerator. "She looks hungry, Daddy. Should I get the good jam?" The good jam was strawberry preserves Sarah had made the summer before she died, the last jar sitting in their refrigerator like a memorial Marcus couldn't bring himself to open. But Sophie was already reaching for it with 8-year-old determination, and Marcus didn't have the heart to stop her. Emma's reaction to Sophie's kindness was immediate and telling. Her carefully controlled composure cracked, tears flowing freely now as she watched this little girl she'd never met offer her most precious possession. "Thank you," Emma whispered, and Marcus caught something in her voice. An accent, maybe, or just the careful pronunciation of someone who'd been trained to speak properly. Sophie beamed and began assembling a sandwich with the focused intensity she brought to all her projects, tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. The normalcy of the moment felt surreal. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 2 children were sharing jam and secrets while Marcus stood guard, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. As Emma ate, Marcus noticed things. The way she held her fork with perfect posture, as if someone had spent years teaching her proper etiquette. The way she automatically folded her napkin in her lap without being asked. The way she said, "May I?" instead of "Can I?" and "Thank you," after every small kindness. These weren't the mannerisms of a runaway from the wrong side of town. These were the habits of someone raised with privilege, someone who'd been taught that manners mattered and appearances counted. The designer purse wasn't stolen or borrowed. It belonged to her. Which raised the question that had been building in Marcus's mind since he'd found her. What was a rich girl doing in his garage at 2 a.m? The answer would have to wait. Emma's eyelids were growing heavy, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. Sophie had already declared that Emma should sleep in her room, dragging blankets and pillows with the enthusiasm of someone planning the world's best sleepover. Marcus didn't have the energy to argue, and truthfully, he wasn't sure he wanted Emma sleeping alone. Something about her fear felt too real, too specific. Whatever she was running from might still be out there in the storm. As he tucked both girls into Sophie's twin bed, listening to their whispered conversations about favorite colors and dream pets, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. He just didn't know how. The next morning brought sunshine and questions. Emma woke early, Marcus discovered, earlier than Sophie, who could sleep through an earthquake if given the chance. He found her in the kitchen at 6:30, standing perfectly still by the window, as if she were afraid to touch anything. She'd folded Sophie's blanket with military precision and stacked the dishes from the night before beside the sink. When Marcus appeared, she flinched slightly, then straightened into a posture that reminded him of soldiers at attention. "Good morning, sir," she said, and the formality in her voice made Marcus's heart ache. What kind of home did this girl come from where children called adults "sir" before breakfast? "Just Marcus," he said, moving to start the coffee maker. "You don't have to be so formal here." Emma nodded but didn't relax, watching his every movement with the alertness of someone always ready to flee. Marcus had seen that look before, in animals at the shelter where Sophie volunteered on weekends. The ones who'd been hurt learned to watch everything, trust nothing. He wondered what had hurt this girl, what had sent her running into a storm. As he scrambled eggs and buttered toast, Marcus felt Emma's eyes cataloguing his movements, memorizing the layout of his kitchen, mapping escape routes. The realization made his hands shake slightly as he plated breakfast. Sophie bounced into the kitchen like a human sunrise, chattering about dreams and plans for the day. Her presence transformed Emma instantly. The rigid posture softened, genuine smiles replaced careful politeness, and for brief moments she looked like what she was, a child. They ate breakfast together, Sophie regaling Emma with stories about school and friends and the art class, where she was learning to draw horses. Emma listened with the intensity of someone starved for normal conversation, asking questions that showed she knew nothing about public school or suburban friendships or the simple freedom to walk to a corner store alone. After breakfast, while Sophie got ready for school, Marcus broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "Emma, I need to know if someone's looking for you, if you're in danger." She was helping him load the dishwasher, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been trained in household tasks, and his question made her freeze. "I can't go back," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. "Please don't make me go back." The desperation in her voice was raw, unguarded, and Marcus felt something protective stir in his chest. This wasn't teenage rebellion or a simple family fight. This was real fear. But fear of what? The phone rang before he could ask. Marcus answered without thinking, his attention still focused on Emma's pale face. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and terrifying in its politeness. "Mr. Thompson, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the Millbrook Police Department. We understand you might have information about a missing child." Marcus's blood turned to ice. Emma had gone completely still beside him, her face white as paper. How had they found her so quickly? How did they even know to call him? As the detective continued speaking, Marcus realized with growing horror that he was about to lose this girl before he even understood what she needed from him. The police station smelled like coffee and disinfectant, a combination that made Marcus's stomach churn. Emma sat beside him on a hard plastic chair, her designer purse clutched in her lap like armor. She hadn't spoken since they'd left his house, and Marcus was beginning to understand that silence was this girl's primary defense mechanism. Detective Chen was kind but thorough, asking questions that felt more like an interrogation than a welfare check. Where had Marcus found Emma? What time? Had she said anything about her family? With each question, Emma seemed to shrink further into herself, becoming smaller and more fragile. The door opened, and Marcus knew immediately that their brief respite was over. The man who entered commanded attention without saying a word. Expensive suit, silver hair, and eyes that could price a person's worth at a glance. Behind him came a woman in equally expensive clothes and a man with a briefcase who had "lawyer" written in every line of his posture. Emma's reaction was immediate and devastating. She pressed herself against Marcus's side, trembling with the force of her fear. "Daddy," she whispered, and the word sounded like a prayer and a curse wrapped together. Richard Hartwell looked at his daughter with the expression of someone who'd found a valuable object he'd misplaced. "Emma, you've caused quite a stir." His voice was controlled, reasonable, and somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He turned to Marcus with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I presume. I want to thank you for looking after my daughter. I'm sure this has been quite an inconvenience." The way he said inconvenience made it clear that he considered Marcus himself to be exactly that. A minor problem to be solved with money and moved past as quickly as possible. Detective Chen began explaining the situation, but Richard Hartwell cut her off with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Detective, I appreciate your department's efficiency, but this is a family matter. My daughter had a disagreement with her stepmother and acted impulsively. Children do these things." He gestured to Emma as if she were an interesting museum exhibit rather than a terrified child. "I'm prepared to make a generous donation to the department's youth programs to show my appreciation for your help." Marcus watched this performance with growing anger. This man was buying his daughter back like she was a piece of lost luggage. The lawyer stepped forward with papers that apparently gave Richard Hartwell the right to take Emma immediately. Marcus found himself standing without remembering the decision to move, placing himself between Emma and her father. "Wait," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Emma, is this what you want?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard Hartwell's carefully controlled expression flickered with annoyance. "Mr. Thompson, while I appreciate your concern, my daughter is 12 years old. She doesn't get to decide where she lives." But Emma was looking at Marcus with desperate hope, as if he might be the first adult in her life to actually ask what she wanted rather than simply telling her what she was going to get. The next few minutes moved with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Papers were signed, arrangements were made, and Emma was efficiently transferred from Marcus's care to her father's custody. She didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't even cry. She simply shut down, becoming as lifeless as a doll being moved from shelf to shelf. Richard Hartwell spoke about boarding schools and therapeutic programs with the detached interest of someone planning a business trip. Marcus tried to object, tried to argue that Emma should have a say in her own life, but the legal system moved with mechanical precision. Money talked, and Marcus's voice was drowned out by the sound of cash changing hands. As they prepared to leave, Emma did something that broke Marcus's heart. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a small sketchbook, pages filled with drawings Marcus hadn't known she'd made. Pictures of Sophie sleeping, of their kitchen table, of the view from Sophie's bedroom window. She tore out one page, a drawing of Marcus's hands holding a coffee mug, and pressed it into his palm. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she was gone, walking beside her father with the mechanical obedience of someone who'd learned that resistance only made things worse. Marcus stood in the police station parking lot, holding a child's drawing, and felt more helpless than he had since the day Sarah died. The house felt empty without Emma's quiet presence. Sophie asked about her constantly, wondering when their new friend would come back to play. Marcus didn't know how to explain that Emma wouldn't be coming back, that some children lived in worlds where playing wasn't always possible. He found himself looking at Emma's drawing obsessively, studying the careful detail in each line. She'd captured something in his hands that he hadn't known was there, a gentleness he'd forgotten he possessed. The drawing went on the refrigerator next to Sophie's school artwork, a reminder of the girl who'd stayed one night and left a piece of her heart behind. Days passed in a haze of routine. Marcus fixed cars, Sophie went to school, and life moved forward with the relentless momentum that doesn't pause for heartbreak. But Emma had left traces everywhere. The good jam jar, finally opened, sat nearly empty in the refrigerator. Sophie had taken to making sandwiches Emma-style with precise folded napkins and perfect posture. Marcus caught himself listening for footsteps in the early morning, expecting to find a perfectly dressed girl standing silently by his kitchen window. The absence of someone you've known for 24 hours shouldn't hurt this much, but Marcus was learning that time wasn't the only measure of impact. 2 weeks after Emma's departure, Marcus discovered something that changed everything. He was cleaning out his truck when he found it wedged beneath the passenger seat, a small, leather-bound journal with Emma's initials embossed in gold. His first instinct was to return it immediately, but when he opened it to find contact information, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Pages and pages of careful handwriting detailed a life that sounded more like a prison than a childhood. Rules about speaking, eating, sitting, breathing. Punishments for infractions that seemed to include everything from smiling too much to asking questions. And scattered throughout, like broken glass in beautiful prose, were Emma's real thoughts about her father, her stepmother, and the boarding school that awaited her in Switzerland. The journal revealed a girl trapped in a golden cage, wealthy beyond imagination, but poorer than any child Marcus had ever met. Emma wrote about servants who were forbidden to speak to her, about meals eaten in silence, about a father who loved her like a possession and controlled her like a business asset. She wrote about her mother, who'd died when Emma was 7, and how different everything had been before. But most heartbreakingly, she wrote about the single night she'd spent in Marcus's house, describing it as the first time she'd felt truly safe since her mother's death. "They asked me what I wanted," she'd written. "No one ever asks me what I want." Marcus sat in his truck in his driveway, holding this window into Emma's soul, and felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. This wasn't about money or privilege or the accident of birth that had placed Emma in one world and Sophie in another. This was about a child being treated like a beautiful object instead of a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams of her own. The rational part of his mind knew there was nothing he could do, that Richard Hartwell's wealth and power made him untouchable. But the father in Marcus, the part of him that would move mountains to protect Sophie, couldn't accept that Emma was beyond help. The opportunity to act came sooner than expected. 3 days after finding the journal, Marcus received a phone call that made his heart race. It was Emma, speaking in whispers from a bathroom in her father's house. "Marcus, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call." Her voice was strained, desperate, and Marcus could hear tears she was trying not to shed. "My father found my journal, the one I left in your truck. He knows I wrote about him, about everything. He's sending me to Switzerland tomorrow, and I'll never be able to leave. Please, I know I have no right to ask, but could you help me, just until I can figure out what to do?" The smart thing would have been to say no. Marcus knew that. Emma was a minor. Her father had legal custody, and interfering would probably land Marcus in jail. But as he listened to this brave, broken girl begging for help, he thought about Sarah and what she would have done. Sarah, who'd volunteered at women's shelters and brought home stray animals and never met a lost soul she couldn't love. Sarah would have packed a bag and been in the car before Emma finished asking. "Where are you?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his keys. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The rescue was easier than it should have been. Emma met him at the end of her father's driveway, a single backpack containing everything she truly cared about. She'd climbed out her bedroom window and walked 1/2 mile in the dark, guided only by the memory of kindness from a man who'd asked what she wanted. As Marcus drove through the night with Emma sleeping in his passenger seat, he realized he was probably making the biggest mistake of his life. But looking at this girl who'd been brave enough to run toward love instead of away from fear, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The safe house Marcus had in mind was his sister's cabin in the mountains, 3 hours away and completely off the grid. Jenny Thompson Walsh lived like a hermit by choice, running a small organic farm and avoiding human contact whenever possible. She owed Marcus more favors than either of them could count, dating back to the time he'd covered for her when she'd run away from their alcoholic father. If anyone would understand the need to protect a child from a toxic parent, it would be Jenny. The cabin had no internet, no cell service, and no way for Richard Hartwell's money to reach them. It was perfect. Emma bloomed in the mountain air like a flower finally getting sunlight. Away from her father's oppressive control, her real personality emerged. Curious, funny, surprisingly talented at practical things like cooking and gardening. She helped Jenny with the farm work, learned to milk goats and gather eggs, and laughed more in her first week at the cabin than she had in months of carefully controlled existence. Marcus visited every weekend, bringing Sophie, who delighted in having a big sister figure to look up to. For the first time since Sarah's death, Marcus felt like they were a complete family again. But perfection couldn't last. Richard Hartwell had resources that most people couldn't imagine, and he'd hired private investigators who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. The call came on a Tuesday morning, Jenny's voice tight with fear as she described the black sedans that had appeared at the end of her mountain road. "They haven't come up to the house yet," she whispered. "But Emma's scared, Marcus, really scared. What do we do?" Marcus felt the walls closing in around them. They'd had 3 weeks of borrowed time, 3 weeks of letting Emma be a normal child. Now reality was knocking at their door with legal papers and the full weight of the system behind it. The confrontation happened in Jenny's front yard, with Emma standing behind Marcus like he was a shield that could protect her from the world. Richard Hartwell emerged from the lead sedan with the same controlled fury Marcus remembered from the police station, but now there was something else in his eyes. genuine concern mixed with wounded pride. "Emma," he said, his voice softer than Marcus had expected. "You've worried me sick. Do you have any idea what you've put me through?" For a moment, Marcus glimpsed the father beneath the businessman, the man who genuinely loved his daughter even if he didn't know how to show it properly. But Emma's response shattered any hope of a simple reconciliation. "I can't go with you, Daddy," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love you, but I can't live in that house anymore. I can't pretend to be the perfect daughter you want when all I want is to be myself." The words hung between them like a bridge that might either bring them together or burn completely. Richard Hartwell looked at his daughter as if seeing her clearly for the first time. And Marcus watched understanding dawn in the older man's eyes. His daughter wasn't rebelling against his love. She was fighting for her right to exist as more than just an extension of his expectations. What happened next surprised everyone, most of all Richard Hartwell himself. Instead of demanding Emma's immediate return, instead of having Marcus arrested for kidnapping, he sat down on Jenny's porch steps and put his head in his hands. "I've been doing this all wrong, haven't I?" he said, and his voice cracked like ice breaking in spring. "Your mother always said I loved too hard, controlled too much. I thought if I could just keep you safe, keep you perfect, nothing bad would ever happen to you. But I've been the bad thing happening to you, haven't I?" The admission hung in the mountain air like a prayer, raw and desperate and completely unexpected. The conversation that followed lasted hours and changed everything. Richard Hartwell told them about Emma's mother, about how her death had shattered him so completely that he'd spent 5 years trying to prevent any more loss by controlling everything around him. Emma told her father about the loneliness, the fear, the desperate need to be loved for who she was rather than who she might become. Marcus and Jenny provided context, perspective, and occasionally coffee, as father and daughter worked through years of miscommunication and pain. It wasn't a perfect healing, those take time, but it was a beginning. The solution they reached was unprecedented and imperfect and absolutely right for their complicated situation. Emma would spend her school year with Marcus and Sophie, attending public school and living the normal childhood she'd never had. Summers and holidays would be with her father, who promised to work with therapists to understand how love could exist without control. Richard Hartwell would support both households financially, not as payment, but as family taking care of family. It wasn't a legal adoption, wasn't a custody arrangement that any court would recognize, but it was a promise between people who'd learned that love comes in many forms. 6 months later, Marcus stood in his backyard watching Emma and Sophie build a fort out of old sheets and determination. The evening sun caught the golden highlights in both girls' hair as they argued good-naturedly about architectural principles and the optimal placement of stuffed animal guards. Richard Hartwell sat beside Marcus on the porch steps, no longer the imposing businessman, but simply a father learning to trust that love could survive without control. "She's happy," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he'd discovered something miraculous. I'd forgotten what her real laugh sounded like. The arrangement wasn't perfect. There were difficult conversations, legal complications, and moments when the unconventional nature of their family structure created problems. But there were also Tuesday morning pancakes and homework help and bedtime stories read to 2 girls who'd found in each other the sisters they'd never known they needed. Marcus had gained a daughter who challenged him to be better. Richard had learned that letting go was sometimes the greatest act of love. And Emma had discovered that families could be built on choice as much as biology. The final page of Emma's new journal, the one she kept openly now instead of hidden beneath her mattress, contained a drawing of 4 people standing in a kitchen. 2 tall figures and 2 shorter ones, all holding coffee mugs or juice boxes, all smiling. At the bottom, in Emma's careful handwriting, she'd written, "This is what home looks like." Marcus found it one morning when Emma had left it open on the counter, and he carried those words with him through the day like a blessing. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Opening your door to a stranger, asking what someone wants instead of telling them what they need, believing that love is always worth the risk. As he watched his daughters, because that's what they were now, both of them, Marcus understood that the night Emma had appeared in his garage hadn't been an ending or a beginning, but a continuation. Life had a way of bringing people together who needed each other, even when they didn't know they were looking. The storm that had driven Emma to his door had been fierce and frightening, but it had also washed away the barriers between them and revealed the truth that family is not always about blood, but always about love. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered, the choice to stay, to fight, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces life had handed them all.